Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to talk about bicameralism in terms of what it is, why we have it, and how it can present a limitation to the legislative process in the United States. To start things off, let's explain how the federal government is set up. The framers wrote in the Constitution that we have a three-part government. One, the legislative branch composed of Congress, which is divided into the Senate and the House of Representatives. Two, the executive branch, headed by the president and the bureaucracy. Three, the judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court and federal courts. This arrangement, called separation of powers, allows each branch to have some control and influence over the others, but none can necessarily dominate each other. However, the structure can also cause turmoil that traces back to the Constitution, where several factors too often cause our basic system to grid to a stop, leading to widespread unhappiness with the federal government. For this video, we will focus on the legislative branch. Let's begin with some historical context behind having a legislative branch in the first place. The Articles of Confederation establish one legislative house consisting of representatives from each state to the Confederation Congress. They were already familiar with Britain's bicameral parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Most of the American colonies adopted bicameral governments when they became states after the Revolutionary War. So, the framers established a bicameral legislature that created two chambers in Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. In Article 1, Section 1 states, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives." Article 1, Section 9 states, "Every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States." However, the framers had a couple of realizations. One framer said, quote, "The House of Commons is elected even though only 10% of British citizens are entitled to vote, and the House of Lords is all aristocrats who inherited their spots. Well, it's important to involve the people in government, so the House of Representatives will be made up of ordinary people," unquote. Another framer said, quote, "We can't have an aristocracy, but we can't have average people making all the laws either. The Senate can be the upper house, a more capable set of men who can be depended on to act with more coolness and wisdom than the popular branch. They can protect the country from the reckless passions of the people, not to mention an excess of lawmaking," unquote. Another framer said, quote, "Senate oversight. It's settled then. We'll make it harder to pass legislation that might arise from the lower house's unrestrained zeal," unquote. So, the framers essentially created a checks and balance system for Congress by establishing bicameralism of creating two separate chambers. When a bill passes through the House, it needs to pass through the Senate. This would be the same the other way around. They viewed the Senate as a wiser set of Congress than the House, based on the different dynamics that happen between them. In the framers' minds, they believed we needed the Senate to provide wisdom in the legislative process and that one chamber of Congress is not solely making all the laws. So, what is the problem with this? Well, as I said, a bill must pass through both chambers, but there must be a majority of the members of both chambers approving the same version of a bill for it to become law. This means that either body of Congress can block bills passed by the other, even if a majority of members of one house supports a piece of legislation. Here is what the framers thought about. Quote, "We can vote against a bill that the other house has passed. We can adopt rules that delay or prevent the passage of bills. We can fail to bring a bill up for a vote. We can pass a bill that is very similar but not identical to a bill adopted in the first house. The two versions have to be identical by even a single comma," unquote. This means that whoever controls Congress can set the process for how fast or slow they want a bill to go through. For example, in 2010, the public wanted an overhaul of U.S. immigration policies. However, the Republican leader in the House opposed the bill. Whether Americans thought it was a good bill or not, their representatives never had the chance to debate or vote on it. Political partisanship can make gridlock especially more likely in a bicameral system. This can further be the case if one political party controls one chamber and another political party controls the other chamber. Representatives in specific political parties have their political agenda on how they want to operate in Congress, and if a bill gets elected that goes against that agenda, the bill will either get defeated or face delays in getting passed. Again, whichever political party controls Congress can set the process for speeding up or slowing down bills based on their political agenda. The framers had hoped to stave off the formation of factions. They thought members of factions cared only about what was good for themselves, not what was good for the country. Nevertheless, political parties triumphed as time went on, and political ideology played a role in how representatives legislate. Perhaps they did not account for the fact that political ideologies could get in the way of the legislative process, where many bills can get held up because different representatives politically disagree with something. During the 114th Congress in 2015 through 2016, 10,659 bills were introduced, but only 189 became laws, which is fewer than 2% of the total number. Many of the passed bills involve such insignificant matters as naming post offices after local notables. This is something to keep in mind when you see polls of people expressing their opinions about Congress, where you have to look at their overall progress or lack of progress. With all of this in mind, let's compare this with a few other legislative systems. In Nebraska, it is the country's only unicameral state legislature since 1937. This means it has one chamber in the state's legislative branch. They just elect their legislators from districts of approximately equal population. For the British Parliament, the power of the House of Lords over the House of Commons was significantly limited in 1911. Parliament passed a bill taking away the Lords' absolute veto over legislation. It could delay legislation, but not permanently squash it. In France and Germany, they both allow, under some circumstances, their lower house to enact legislation without the approval of the upper house. In Norway, if the two houses disagree, they must meet together. If 2/3 of the group vote in favor of a law, they could pass it. I bring these comparisons up not to say we need to copy and paste another country's legislative system, but see how those systems at least have lower barriers to make progress through passing certain bills. It is to show that not everything in the legislative system has to be so strict with analyzing a bill, debating it, and passing it. It is just a matter of seeing what works and does not work on the federal level. Let's take a look at an example of bicameralism's limitation on the legislative process. From 1899 to 1950, 4,384 Black people were murdered by hanging. 99% of the perpetrators went free because state-level courts failed to prosecute them. On August 11, 1913, in Lawrence County, South Carolina, Richard Puckett found himself accused of accosting a white woman. Puckett denied the charge, and the woman did not identify him as the culprit. Nevertheless, he was jailed. He was one of 51 Black Americans known to have been lynched that year. In 1918, Republican Representative Leonidas C. Dyer introduced anti-lynching legislation into Congress. His bill intended to have people accused of lynching tried in federal court, but Southerners in the House defeated the bill several times. In 1922, it finally passed. Dyer's legislation then moved to the Senate for consideration. Southern members of that chamber, all of them Democrats, denounced the bill. To prevent the bill from ever coming up for a vote, a group of senators filibustered. That is, they talked on and on until it was clear they would never stop. They said that the bill, quote, is an attack on the rights of states to deal with lynchers however they see fit. Lynching is a way to protect white women from Black men. It keeps the races separate, unquote. Dyer's measure failed. Other representatives introduced similar bills in the 1930s and 1940s. The House passed 3 of these bills. The Senate filibustered 2 of them, and the third was passed over 3 times through legislative trickery. It did not matter that a 1937 opinion poll found that 72% of Americans, including 57% of Southerners, supported anti-lynching laws. Over the years, 7 U.S. presidents urged Congress to pass an anti-lynching law. No bill ever came up for a vote in the Senate, however, because members either filibustered or threatened to do so. There was still no federal law against lynching, but on June 13, 2005, the Senate passed Resolution 39. This resolution apologized to the victims of lynching and the descendants of those victims for the failure of the Senate to enact anti-lynching legislation. 13 years later, in 2018, the Senate unanimously passed anti-lynching legislation introduced by 3 senators, 2 Democrats and a Republican. However, the House failed to take action. The Senate passed the same bill in 2019 and sent it to the House, but again, not much has happened. By 2022, the first federal anti-lynching law, called the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, finally made lynching a federal hate crime. It established a federal penalty of up to 30 years in prison for a conspiracy to commit a hate crime that results in serious bodily injury. This legislation passed after more than a century and so many failed attempts. But that is the thing. Something as important as anti-lynching took this long to become federal law because the way our legislative system was designed allowed representatives with a political agenda against an anti-lynching bill delay or vote down this bill over and over again. Imagine if an anti-lynching bill was passed over 100 years ago. It would have been easier to classify lynching against Black people as a hate crime and prosecute the offenders. Imagine all the victims who got lynched, but who did not get justice this whole time. It is great that we have a federal law to make lynching a federal hate crime, but did we need to wait a century to make this kind of progress? Not really. That is the point I am making with this example, which is to show we did not have to wait this long. But our representatives throughout the years chose to delay this progress. And it also did not help that our bicameralism was not set up in a way to have other methods of passing important legislation like this in an appropriate amount of time. So, certain issues can remain static if both chambers do not agree on having a bill passed, even when the majority of citizens know passing the bill would be in the best interest of the country. In conclusion, bicameralism was designed by the framers to create balance, wisdom, and deliberation within Congress. By dividing the legislative branch into the House and the Senate, they hoped to prevent irrational decisions from being made and ensure that bills were carefully considered from multiple perspectives. As I said, it is a checks and balances between the House and Senate. However, this structure can slow down or even block progress. The requirement that both chambers agree on the exact same bill can lead to political gridlock, especially when partisanship and conflicting political agendas take center stage. As the example of anti-lynching legislation shows, even when the majority of Americans support actions on anti-lynching, Congress can become stuck when one chamber disagrees with the other chamber. This ended up delaying justice for the victims of lynching for decades, despite a law being passed in 2022 that established a federal hate crime for lynching. So, while bicameralism was meant to ensure there would be thoughtful lawmaking, it also opened the door for progress taking longer than necessary to happen, especially when there are not any structural systems to prevent gridlocks from slowing down the legislative process. In the next video, we are going to talk about the Senate and how representation is designed there. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be updated when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you're capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.